My son and his wife mocked my new husband at my wedding. Then the old man shut everyone up. That sentence kept running through my head for days afterward, like a line you can't unhear. It was the exact moment everything changed, the one the photographer somehow caught from across the room. My face halfway between hurt and fury, my son's smirk, guests frozen with their champagne flutes in midair. I remember thinking in the split second between shame and action that I had spent most of my life trying to make other people feel secure. That afternoon, I decided I would make myself feel secure for once. I had been 61 when I stood beneath the arbor, the lace of my dress catching the light, the string quartet playing something my late husband had loved. People are puzzled by later life weddings. They imagine small, quiet affairs, maybe a dinner, a courthouse ceremony, a nod and a toast. Ours wasn't that. Not because we wanted to show off, because after 22 years alone, after a widowhood of careful meals eaten in the soft blue light of a television screen, after endless nights of practicing bravery, I wanted an afternoon that felt like an answer to the loneliness, beautiful, deliberate, and held. I'd spent months planning. It was mostly simple things. Good flowers, a cake from the bakery that still remembered my order from my first wedding, my friend Vivian's insistence on ivory chair covers instead of plain wood. I wanted texture, the way your hands linger on something that's been made with thought. I wanted voices to carry laughter that didn't sound apologetic, music that made people stand a little straighter. I wanted my grandchildren to see their grandmother in a way that didn't include hospital corridors or whispered worries. People ask me how I met Eli like it was a secret. It wasn't glamorous. We met at a community lecture on urban gardens. I like to think I went for the talk and stayed for his smile. He was patient in the way old people sometimes are, the kind of patience you don't have to explain. It simply is. He had a way of listening as if he were collecting the contours of a story and then honoring them. He was older than me, yes, but calling him old in any small way felt wrong the way it did when you call a mountain big. He had lived an enormous life, and his gentleness was the part of him that mattered to me. Word got out that I was seeing someone. In hindsight, I should have expected the commentary. I'd raised a son who, like many men his age, had a set of expectations about what his mother's life should look like. He hadn't liked the idea of me dating at first. He tolerated the dinner introductions. He faked gratitude at holiday cards. But it was never friendly. There had been times when his need for my assistance had been quiet, almost invisible. A forgotten loan in the shuffle of bills, a phone call that always ended with him asking if I could cover rent for a few weeks. And there had been times when the requests were not requests at all, but a tone of entitlement that made me ache. That ache is what sits behind the story that afternoon. Not a sudden betrayal, but a long history of small, accumulating thing after thing that added up to one very clear shape. Darius was a good man in some ways. He could be charming, he could be funny with his nieces, he could make soup when he meant it, but he had a habit of measuring people by how much they could give him. His wife Tasha was sharper. If Darius could be soft and unreliable, Tasha was all edges. She had a way of saying things that were meant to be jokes and landed as knives. Together, they had made a private economy out of emotional leverage. It had been exhausting watching it from the sidelines. I tried to draw lines. I tried to protect myself. But what do you do when your child has been conditioned for years to expect your openness as default? You set small boundaries and then sometimes you fail to keep them. You give in because it hurts the other person to hear no. You pay a bill because it would have meant their children sleeping on a couch. You forgive because you remember the baby they were. That is the complicated territory of being a parent and the trap that had put me where I was. The guest list for the wedding reflected all of that complexity. There were people from my past life, colleagues who had become friends after decades of Sunday volunteer work, and a few names that felt tentative, as if they might not show at all. The ceremony itself, gentle and unshowy, went well. It's funny how when something you fear most actually happens, your senses either go numb or sharpen to a painful clarity. I remember the way the light landed on Eli's hair as he waited for me at the end of the aisle, the slight tremor in his hand when he reached for mine, the softness of his whisper, "You look like spring," right before the vows. I remember thinking, this is what I wanted. This steadiness, this love that didn't need anything from me but me. That should have been enough. We moved to the reception as if into a different world. The banquet hall had been transformed. Silk linens, soft gold plates, low garden arrangements that smelled faintly of honeysuckle. Glasses clinked. Somewhere a child laughed loudly and nobody shushed them. Vivian sat at my left, her hand warm and steady, and she mouthed, "Breathe," which was ridiculous because I had been breathing my whole life, but she knew what I didn't, that I was holding myself up with a thread of hope that could fray. At first, the barbs were small, a laugh that seemed a hair too loud near the dessert table, a tisk when Eli excused himself to refill my glass. People make comments at weddings. Some of it is harmless, some of it cuts. Then Darius, who had too much to drink and not enough discretion, made a joke about my dress.
"Mom, you look like you're trying to relive the 70s, he said, loud enough for half the table to hear, his voice the kind that seeks a reaction and feeds on it. There was forced laughter from the cousins, the kind that covers discomfort with noise. I tried to let it slide. It was easier at first to laugh with him than to sit in the recognition that he'd crossed a line. But then, after a few more drinks, his tone shifted from teasing to something cruel and practiced. He said things that made the room drop into a colder silence. "You always did have a thing for older men," he said to Eli, and for an instant I thought maybe no one had heard. But they had. The quartet missed a note. A woman at the next table looked away as if she didn't want to witness what was unfolding. Tasha was worse. She didn't bother to disguise her contempt. She leaned over to a friend and said something about gold digging, that old, ugly word, with a smile that did not reach her eyes. The word struck me because it wasn't about money, not exactly. It was about worth. It was a dismissal that had layers of shame built into it. I felt the air sucked right out of the room. I've been called many things in my life, some of them true, some of them not. Never before had I felt that kind of public diminishing, as if the life I had led, the losses I had known, the quiet sacrifice of raising a child and grieving a husband were suddenly insignificant in the eyes of the people I loved. Those looks from the relatives who had always protected the gossip were worse than any words. It's one thing to quarrel with your adult child in private. It's another to have your new life paraded like a misstep. I remember touching Eli's hand and feeling him steady. He did not flinch. He did not rise to the bait. Instead, he gave me a look that said, without flourish, "Take it. Live your life." That look is what I would go back to in the quiet months that followed. It was not macho or theatrical. It was spare and precise, like someone who had practiced kindness in silence. But Darius kept going. He stood up halfway through the toast and made a speech that was part joke, part accusation. He told a story about my first apartment after my husband died, embellished and cruel, and then he laughed at the punchline as if he had nailed some kind of truth. Tasha clapped. The sound was sharp, too theatrical. People shifted in their seats. I saw pity blooming on a few faces, and pity is a dangerous thing because it is not love. It measures distance. I felt my face heat. I had a decision to make in that hot, jarring moment. I could let it pass and collect the polite condolences later, let the awkwardness be something we smoothed over with dessert and time. Or I could step up from the current of small humiliations and be very clear. The thing about being older is you learn that boundaries are no longer optional. They are the railing that keeps you from falling into habits you regret. I stood. There are people who think confrontation needs shouting to be real. It doesn't. I walked to the center of the room and I asked for the microphone. Sound bloomed across the hall. The quartet trailed off. Faces turned toward me with a mix of curiosity and that gossipy hunger people have for family drama. My throat was dry, but my voice steadied. "Darius," I said, and I made sure the word landed. He blinked like he didn't expect me to use his name like that. "Out of my wedding." It was not a scream. It was a simple sentence with the weight of many small ignored no's behind it. He laughed, foolish and sharp. "Mom, come on." "No," I said. "Out of my wedding. Out of my life if you can't be kind tonight." The room stilled in that way rooms do when they realize someone has crossed an unspoken line. Vivian's hand tightened on the back of my chair, as if she were waiting to see what would happen next. Some guests sat frozen with their forks halfway to their mouths. I could feel the hum of conversation contract into a single point. Our family, our dignity. Darius pushed back in the way sons sometimes do when they think their mother is being theatrical. He stood and said, loud, "You wouldn't even be here without me. Don't you dare."
He didn't finish because the manager of the hall, a thin woman with an apologetic face, came up behind him and whispered something. I didn't hear the words, but the manager's hand was on Darius's sleeve, and his face drained of color. Tasha started to protest, to invent a reason why they were being forced out. She called me names that were supposed to sting but sounded ridiculous in the open air. I had thought in the hush before I spoke that the brunt of what would happen would be humiliation. I had been prepared, if not for the heat of shame, then for the smart, curt edges of family estrangement that might come later. I wasn't prepared for the sensation of being watched like an exhibit. I wasn't prepared for the way my son would let himself be led away with that particular combination of embarrassment and entitlement, as if he had been denied his right to humiliate me. When they left, there was a kind of suspended silence, the part of the reception where everyone collects themselves and wonders what they should say. Eli stood and came to me the way he always did, quietly. He studied me by putting his hands around mine. You did what you had to do, he whispered. You are not a thing to be mocked. I could have expected a grand gesture then. I had imagined in some secret part of my mind that he'd stand and deliver some magnanimous speech that would shine a light so bright on the cruelty that it would be blinding. But that isn't him. Eli was composed, as if he had learned to be composed because his life had at some point demanded steadiness. He smiled at the guests with a small, almost private humor, the kind reserved for people who don't need validation to be solid.
And then he said something that stopped the room in a way my command to throw my son out had not. He did not shout it. He did not seek applause. He leaned into the microphone, the same one I had used, and he said softly and almost apologetically, I don't like drama. I also don't enjoy being tested. The murmur was immediate. People craned to hear. I could feel my heart in my throat. I didn't know what he would say next. His hand found mine under the table, a clandestine pressure that was meant only for me. The room held its breath, like a body that's just submerged and waiting to resurface. He smiled in a way that was almost sad, and he said it plainly. I don't mean to make a spectacle, but there's something you should know. I chose to keep this quiet because I wanted someone who loved me for who I am, not for what I have. But this moment calls for a little clarity. There are ways to reveal things that are neat and performed, and there are ways to reveal things that are quiet and earth-moving. Eli's way was the latter. He looked around the room, his gaze steady and direct, and then he said the sentence that would be on people's lips for weeks. I'm a billionaire. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. For a second, nobody moved. Forks stopped. Conversations hung in midair. The quartet's bow trembled against a single string and then stilled. My own breath left me with a sound between a laugh and a sob. I didn't expect to need such proof. The revelation felt almost irrelevant, and then it didn't. It reframed everything, not because money is magic, but because the confession exposed a truth about motives. It lifted the veil on why people had sneered, why my son had thought scorn was a tool. Darius's face paled. I saw mortification, and underneath it something like fear. Tasha's jaw tightened. The people who had looked at me with measured sympathy now looked at Eli in a different light. Admiration, bewilderment, curiosity. Some of the guests who'd once whispered about the boldness of my age leaned forward, as if to glean information about social standing. It was awful and revealing in the same breath. Eli hadn't said it to punish anyone. He said it because he wanted to make something plain. The laughter had nothing to do with money. It had to do with character. If someone treats you cruelly when they think you are vulnerable, they will treat you cruelly when they think you are secure. He wanted us all to see that. And when he said it, he did it without vanity. There was no chest thumping, no show of extravagance. He didn't list properties or accounts. He offered instead a quiet set of facts and let the room do with them what it would. That moment, the gasp, the attempted recovery of various guests, the small awkward cough from the back, is what made the evening turn. People who had been comfortable in their judgments found themselves confronted with the reality that their gossip had been shallow. People who had made assumptions about me were forced by Eli's plainness to look again at their own motives. I should tell you that I felt vindicated, and I did. But vindication and victory are different things, and victory felt thin. When you press down on someone you love and they crumble, you don't always get the satisfaction you expect. Instead, you get questions. Do I love my child less because I won't be an ATM for their irresponsibility? Do I show compassion by rescuing them or by making them face the consequences of their choices? Money complicates that calculus, but it doesn't resolve it. There was, of course, chatter after the reveal. Some cousins asked low, practical questions about the estate, an awkwardness that made my cheeks burn. A cousin I barely knew sidled up and said something about investments in a tone that was clearly trying to curry favor. The thing about money is that it magnifies character. It draws out the best and the worst. Eli understood that.
He had spent a life watching how people rearranged themselves around power, and he had chosen, with a deliberate humility, to step into my life without letting his wealth define him. He had kept it private because he wanted to be chosen for who he was. But the test had been made for us without our permission, and he decided, in that instant, that clarity was the best response. Later, when people asked how I felt about his revelation, I tried to explain. It's both easier and harder than you might think. Easier because on a purely practical level, certain things could be fixed. The old debt from my mortgage that had hung like a shadow over my days could be addressed. The nagging financial anxiety that made me answer the phone with a tightness in my chest could be eased. But the harder part was what I needed to keep: dignity. I didn't want money to become the new argument. I didn't want my son to feel punished or entitled because of it. And I certainly didn't want anyone to think I had married a man for money. The point of my union with Eli was not to secure my comfort. It was to open a chapter of companionship. The money was incidental to that love, a tool that could be deployed for good or bad, depending on the hands that wielded it. As the conversation swirled, I watched Darius sink into a chair at the far end of the room, his face a study in hurt and fury braided together. I thought of all the times he had sat in my lap as a child, the way his hair had smelled of the back porch in summer. Memory is a treacherous ship that carries both ache and tenderness. I loved him fiercely, and that love did not disappear because of his cruelty. But love is not always the same as rescue, and that distinction, one of the hardest I have had to make in my life, was now laid bare in front of everyone I knew. After the revelation, the tension shifted into an odd kind of awkwardness. Some guests lingered, approaching me with clumsy apologies or statements of solidarity that felt rehearsed.
Others drifted away, suddenly uninterested in the remainder of the party. Eli moved through the room with an ease that startled me. He answered questions with a calm, measured voice that never once referred to the money itself as a weapon. He spoke instead of values, of the importance of kindness, of the way people should be treated regardless of wealth. And his words smoothed the raw edges of the afternoon in a way that felt steadying rather than triumphant. Vivian never left my side. Later, she would tell me that she had been terrified for me, that she had been ready to pull me away and run if things got worse. But in the moment, she held out the smallest of comforts, a squeezed hand, a wink that said, "You did right." Marcus, Eli's lawyer, who had been quietly present, the sort of practical ally you read about in novels but rarely meet in real life, offered to handle any awkward conversations that might follow. He said it with a practicality that lacked condescension, the way a good surgeon speaks of stitches. Darius did not pick up his phone that night. He did not come to the next morning's brunch, the small gathering we had intended to make amends in case of any leftover awkwardness. Instead, there was a message left on my machine, clipped and cold. "You made a scene," he wrote. "You embarrassed us. You humiliated me." It was a message that landed like a finality, as if he was choosing to fold himself off the map rather than engage. I sat on the back porch that evening with Eli, the noise of the city settling into a distant hum. He poured us both tea out of an old pot he liked, the kind with a tiny chip on the spout. We did not speak for a long while. The sunset stained the edges of the clouds in the kind of colors that make you want to write poetry, and for once I felt too tired to turn it into anything. In the stillness, I realized how exhausting it had been to hold myself together in public. The weight of performance had been heavy for most of my adult life, and now I was letting it go. There was a strange relief in the rupture. "I'm sorry," Eli said at last, not apologizing for revealing his wealth, but for the pain we had been forced to endure. He said it with a kind of closeness that felt like a new, private layer being added to the relationship. I thought of how his life had been built around a kind of discretion, and how, in the span of an afternoon, discretion had both failed and succeeded. That night I thought about the future. I thought about all the ways the simple fact of money would complicate family dynamics. Would my son see an opportunity for rescue? Would he see it as an invitation to take back old habits? Would Tasha relocate her contempt into a currency that bought influence? None of those questions had neat answers. Money, like fire, can warm you or burn you, depending on how close you stand.
I also thought about what it meant to have chosen dignity.
When I had stood and told my son to leave, I had not done it because I wanted a spectacle. I had done it because shame had been an old habit, and I had finally refused it. That refusal felt like a small, fierce beam of light. It did not fix the past, but it made clear what I would accept in my life going forward. It was a decision rooted in self-respect and an understanding that love is not always indulgence. It can be discipline too. The days that followed were a blur of messages, some supportive and some unhelpful. There were the obligatory calls from relatives who wanted to know the details, as if they were following a soap opera. There were a few warm notes from people who had been at the event and who wrote about how proud they were of me. There was my daughter-in-law's silence, which felt like a vacuum that had to be respected. I did not call Darius the next day. I did not demand his apology. I let the space between us be, because I had to know if he would choose to cross it. Eli, for his part, handled the practical things with a lightness I found refreshing. He did, in a way, what the old men in stories do. He offered security without trumpeting it. He asked if I wanted the financial anxiety settled. I told him I would accept help for the things that had kept me awake, small, sensible things like clearing an old mortgage balance and ensuring my grandchildren had a modest trust for their education. I was not interested in grand gestures. I wanted the kind of help that restored dignity without creating dependence. He understood, and I could see in his face that he admired that boundary. And yet, even as we talked about trustees and polite arrangements, there was a part of me that mourned the simple closure of the day. Marriage, when you are young, often seems like a story with a clear arc. You meet, you fight, you reconcile. When you are older, the arcs are complicated by histories. People's pasts have to be negotiated with care. I had a long itinerary of forgiveness to walk through, a map that included not only my own feelings, but the well-being of the grandchildren and the consequences for Darius's behavior. There were practical things to think about, conversations with the venue about how to handle unwanted guests in the future, a decision about whether to invite Darius back for Thanksgiving, and the question of whether to let certain relatives who had been openly cruel take part in future family celebrations. Those were small policy decisions, but each one stood for a deeper principle. Do we tolerate exploitation for the sake of family image, or do we insist on a standard of behavior that preserves dignity? When you are 61 and you love someone, you make choices more like a steward than a burglar. You do not take the person's life and rearrange it for your own satisfaction. You ask, you negotiate, and you hold each other accountable. That clarity had not always been in my emotional repertoire. I had for many years been a fixer, the person who smoothed edges and cleaned up messes. Eli's presence in my life gave me permission to be myself, without being the default caretaker for everyone else's chaos. But permission and practice are different things. Old habits die slowly. Darius's absence after the wedding was a wound that fretted and throbbed at odd hours. I would catch myself sometimes reaching for the phone to call him, to say something small and ordinary. I didn't, because the line between enabling and loving had been redrawn that afternoon in a public way. The revelation of Eli's wealth changed the social geometry of my life. Suddenly, every peripheral figure who had once considered me a curiosity began to pop up with opinions and advice. There were the well-meaning friends who suggested that we use the resources to teach Darius a lesson. There were others who said we should immediately write him a check and restore him. I learned very quickly how much people project their own anxieties onto decisions that belong to you. That discovery strengthened my resolve to make our choices based on principle rather than pressure. And that is where I must stop for now. The afternoon had ended with the startling quiet of the reveal, the ripples moving outward from our small circle. Some waves were small, awkward family texts, stilted encounters at PTA meetings. Some were large, phone calls from distant cousins, and the lingering ache in my chest where I missed the sun I'd raised. The choice I had made to say no in that room would have consequences. The reveal of Eli's reality had complicated everything, and it would force us all to reckon with who we were beneath our assumptions. What I did not yet know that night, sitting on the porch with a chipped teapot and the echo of music in my ears, was how long the healing and the fallout would take, nor how the quiet man who had steady hands would stand beside me as the days unfurled. I knew only that I had done something I had never done before. I had refused to shrink for others. I had asked for dignity, and in doing so, I had opened a door I could not close. If this story means anything, it is that dignity comes at a cost,
and that the cost is sometimes the world you thought you owned. It also means love can arrive late in life and be as real as when it comes young. The rest, the reckonings, the choices about mercy and consequence, the slow steps toward whatever reconciliation may come, was still ahead of me. If this story is hitting a nerve and you want to hear more real-life moments like this, please subscribe. I promise to keep them honest. The days after the wedding felt like waking up in a house that had been rearranged while I slept. Some things were in exactly the same place. Others, like the relationship with my son, had been moved to the other side of the room and bolted there.
People called to offer soft apologies or awkward condolences. Others called to ask me questions about things I barely understood. Taxes, trusts, the polite etiquette of sudden revelations. I answered with the practical, steady voice I had been practicing since the day I decided to stop shrinking. Eli insisted we start with small, sensible changes. He did not want to remap my life with a flourish. He wanted to remove the weight that had forced me into meanness toward myself. The mortgage that had sat like a low-grade ache was paid. The medical debt I had quietly carried for years was cleared. He set up modest trusts for the grandchildren's education in a way that felt careful rather than theatrical. No headlines, he said once, when I asked what he'd like us to do about all of it. Just safety. That, to him, meant ensuring the practical things that allowed me to breathe without changing the shape of my personhood. We also spoke at length about what help would look like if Darius came back asking. It's easy for outsiders to assume that money solves messy human problems. They do not know grief or habits or the long architecture of dependence. Eli knew this, not because he had failed at money, but because he had watched people fracture around it. He suggested a framework instead of a gift: accountability, professional support, and boundaries. He offered resources that could be used toward rebuilding a life, if and only if Darius accepted certain things: counseling, honest financial accounting, and a plan to repay or make restitution, however small, to those he had hurt. My role in those conversations surprised me more than once. Old pattern said, "Mother, you fix." The new pattern, which felt righteous and fearful in equal measure, said, "Mother, you choose." I chose. I chose to insist on terms that protected the grandchildren and honored my dignity. I did not want to be the woman whose love meant an endless reserve of bailouts. Eli supported that. I realized, with both relief and grief, how much my own life had been spent making myself available as a cushion for other people's mistakes. That cushion had, quietly, become a shape of my identity, a martyr's badge I wore without asking. Choosing differently felt like a sliver of freedom. Darius did not take kindly to that framework. In the weeks that followed the wedding, he sent messages that oscillated between anger and performance, long, dramatic texts that included the occasional rhetorical flourish about betrayal and usurpation. Tasha called once and left a message that was equal parts accusation and wounded entitlement. She insisted we'd humiliated them both, that they had been unfairly expelled. I listened to the messages once and then deleted them. It was a small ritual of refusal I performed for my own sake. His spiral was not instant theatricality. It was the slow erosion you see in a photograph left out in the sun. A contract Darius had been counting on fell through.
Old creditors came calling, and there was no safety net under him because he had long been living on the assumption that one would appear when needed. He started missing appointments. Calls to old friends were curt and offensive. He lost the apartment he'd been sharing with Tasha for a time. When they finally landed with her sister for a few weeks, they were tired in a way that seems only to belong to people who have spent a long time asking the world for favors and then discovering the tab has come due. It would have been easy to rush in with money, to quiet the pain with a check and then smile at the cameras. I thought about doing exactly that at least twice. Then I thought of the pattern those checks would reinforce. Eli and I agreed, again and again, on one measure. Rescue without change is cruelty disguised as kindness. If I had forgiven Darius's prior behavior with money, I would have both enabled him and trained him not to change. That is love that serves itself, not someone else. Marcus, Eli's lawyer, stepped in quietly. He did not wave legal papers around to intimidate. He offered pragmatic help. He connected Darius with an experienced bankruptcy attorney who would take the case without the predatory edges some of these firms have. Marcus also used his network to find a financial counselor and a therapist who had experience with addiction and entitlement cycles. The offer was practical and conditional. Marcus explained the options to Darius without judgment, laying out the process with plain language. You can take help without strings, or you can take help that teaches you how to live. Which do you want? He asked simply. When Darius first met with the counselor, he slammed the door on the conversation. He raged at the legal advice. He refused to accept constraint as anything but punishment. Watching him in those early days felt like witnessing the collapse of someone who had been carrying shame under a mask of bluster for decades. The hardest scenes were the ones where he tried to charm his way back into my life, offering me apologies that felt rehearsed, promises that sounded like the old scripts. I would not let him back in on terms that smelled like that script. There were moments, lonely, tender, when I questioned myself. Love is a stubborn thing. I would sit with the grandchildren and feel that tug you feel when the baby in your arms makes the world soft. I would hear Darius's voice on an old voicemail, humming along to a song he used to sing, and my heart would crack open in a way that made every boundary ache. Even after the wedding confrontation, I found myself imagining the life that might have been different if a word had been said earlier, if a chance had been taken when Darius was young and less stubborn. But those reflections were not instructions. They were the geography of grief. As autumn moved in, things changed. Not dramatically at first, but in the steady, granular way that real work does.
Darius filed for bankruptcy with the counsel Marcus had connected him to. He agreed, reluctantly, to enter weekly sessions with a financial advisor who forced him to list debts he'd been avoiding. He filled out forms for job placement programs. He began, haltingly, to do repair work for the community center that had once given him odd freelance jobs. It was humble labor, painting a fence, hauling donations, sweeping mats after classes. It was the kind of labor that plants you back into the sameness of the world. Sweat, routine, accountability, the dull ache of honest work. Tasha, for her part, pulled away at first and then started attending some of the counseling sessions. Pride takes a long time to soften. There were embarrassing moments. Once, a local columnist, someone who knew the town's gossip better than their own family history, published a snide piece about the elderly bride and her sudden riches. Darius, stung and defensive, called me that night and used a string of invectives that left my chest sore. I did not pick up. Instead, I texted through the emotional fog, "When you're ready, come repair." It was not the grandest message. It was a boundary made of words. Slowly, the public narrative shifted. Where once people had whispered about me with sly assumptions, they began to ask different questions. The philanthropic projects Eli and I chose to support were modest and practical. A local shelter for older women facing housing insecurity, a small fund for medical needs for seniors without family support, and a community garden program that paired volunteers with retired residents for companionship. The foundation that would later bear a name we chose together started with small grants to organizations that helped women like the ones I had known, women who had loved, lost, and been left without an advocate. We did not announce a mega donation or stage a gala. Eli insisted on low-profile partnership grants that strengthened existing charities rather than creating a new bureaucracy. That choice mattered in more ways than one. When people asked why we weren't flaunting the money, my answer was honest. We wanted to do something that made life easier for people without turning their dignity into a headline. That ethic guided the way we handled Darius's case, too. Eli created a quiet fund that paid for professional help for those who truly wanted to rebuild, but the terms were strict. No direct handouts that would substitute for work, no endless cover-ups. The fund paid for counseling, for legal advice, for job training. It did not write blank checks. Darius could apply like anyone else, and would be accepted only if he complied with a plan. At first, he balked, of course. The plan, to him, looked like surrender. But one winter morning, thin light, the smell of cigarettes and cold, he called me and said, softly, "I will try." He did not say it with theatrical humility.
He said it like a man who had been given the possibility of a different life and was terrified of failing at it yet again. That admission felt like a small, miraculous thing. It was not a sudden conversion. It was the slow opening of a door that had been built of pride. The months that followed were a montage of small, often unglamorous steps. There were group therapy sessions where Darius sat with people who had been in debt and addiction and betrayal. He listened more than he spoke. He began to keep a journal because his counselor suggested it. He wrote long, clumsy entries that read like the early drafts of a confession. He attended financial literacy classes and learned, sometimes with visible humiliation, how interest compounded and how budgets work. He took on part-time work at the center and later at a small hardware store where a manager liked his easy charm and slow humor. The work did not pay much at first, but the dignity of a paycheck was palpable. He also started attending a 12-step style group for men who had repeatedly taken advantage of those closest to them. There were no miracles in the group, just the steady, grueling work of people admitting faults and asking others to hold them accountable. When the first letter arrived, it was small and folded. Darius had written it on lined notebook paper with a ballpoint pen that left dark smudges. He left it at my door, uncertain and formal. I found it in the morning beside my garden boots. The address read simply, "To Mom." The first lines were halting, then grew steadier as if his hand found itself. He wrote, "I am sorry for being a son who took you for granted. I am sorry for the times I made you smaller so I could feel bigger. I do not expect anything, but your forgiveness is what I ask for. I am working on myself. I am writing this because I want you to know I am not the man I was that afternoon." I read it in the garden as the light warmed the soil. Reading the letter felt like a new kind of conversation, one that required no immediate response. It felt honest and imperfect, and therefore real. I did not write back at first. I needed to see the pattern, but I kept the letter in a drawer where I could take it out and read it when doubt crept in. The letter was the first real piece of evidence that the man who had once stood and mocked me had begun, however slowly, to look at his reflection. Months later, Darius agreed to an on-camera interview with a small local station. It was humbling to watch him sit under the lights and tell the town about his failures, in a voice that was neither belligerent nor theatrical. He admitted to his behavior at the wedding, to his entitlement, to the years he'd relied on my softness. He spoke of repair and of learning, not with the flourish of a man seeking absolution, but with the tired steadiness of someone doing the work. The piece ran on a slow news night and drew more compassion than scorn.
People who had once whispered now called him brave for speaking plainly. That public confession did not erase the past. It did, however, mark a turning point. It opened a space for accountability, and later on for guarded reconnection. Reconnection came in rules and increments. The first time I allowed the grandchildren to spend an afternoon alone with Darius was at the community garden, a public place where other people would be witnesses. He arrived early with a small backpack of snacks and a nervous smile. The children were hesitant, then melted into the simple delight of digging in the earth. They did not ask awkward questions. They just enjoyed the soil on their fingernails, the thin, miraculous joy of planting something and hoping it would grow. Watching them, I felt the old soft spot open up just a fraction. I also felt the responsibility to guard that tenderness and not allow it to be exploited. Tasha's story shifted too. She had been hardened by loss and pride. Watching Darius try, trip, falter, stand up, did something to her edges. She enrolled in some workshops with him and began slowly to accept that she had often used contempt to keep intimacy at bay. Her steps were less visible in the early months, but they were present. She started coming to family gatherings where she could be civil, then polite, then sometimes warm. Not every step was steady. Old habits reasserted themselves occasionally, but the trend moved in a gentler direction. Eli and I renewed our vows in a quiet ceremony a year later. It was not the showy kind of repetition that seeks validation from an audience. It was a small gathering, mostly immediate friends and a few relatives who had been quietly steady. We stood under the same arbor. I insisted on using the same lace from my first dress, a tiny sentimental choice, and exchanged new promises that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with choice. We promised to keep one another safe and to insist on dignity. We promised to be honest and to give each other the space to fail and to rebuild. It felt private and sacred in the way that renewal often is. Around that time, our modest philanthropic efforts found their shape. We created a small foundation focused on elder dignity, a name that I and Eli argued about for an afternoon and then chose quietly. The foundation gave grants to neighborhood groups that provided companionship, meals, and legal advice to older women who otherwise would be invisible in systems built for efficiency rather than humanity.
We funded transportation for medical appointments, small home repairs, and social programming so seniors might not spend their days alone. Eli insisted that the grants be responsive rather than performative. They were to be administered by local nonprofits with long-standing relationships in their communities.
The foundation also funded a pilot program for families in distress, targeted grants that would pay for counseling, mediation, and short-term legal assistance to families where older relatives were being exploited. The idea, Riley, was to make our painful story useful. We did not want to create a comfort for people to exploit, but rather to create a resource that would encourage accountability while protecting elders. Eli thought of it in terms of systems. I thought of it in terms of the women I had known who had nowhere to turn. Together, we designed something that could be both practical and tender. Darius's path continued to be nonlinear. There were days when he would call and say something hopeful, and days when he would slide back into old scripts. He lost some friendships, gained new, steadier ones, and found a rhythm that included work, therapy, and the occasional relapse into old protective mechanisms. His apologies grew into action. Small letters left at my door, a bouquet left without ceremony, apologies to his children that were simple and direct. The grandchildren responded in the steady way children do, with forgiveness quicker than adults, tempered by a child's expectation that the world will be righted. At a community event where the foundation had sponsored a mobile clinic, I watched a scene that felt like small redemption. Darius stood at a booth handing out information about local services. He was neither parade-like nor ashamed. He was present. A woman approached him, someone he had once borrowed money from and never paid back, and they talked quietly. Later, she told me that his apology had been the first time she felt seen. I felt my chest unclench in a way I had not known I needed. Moments like this were the currency of slow repair. There were hard choices along the way. Some relatives never returned to the fold. There were people who welcomed gifts but not accountability, and they slipped out of our lives. There were scenes I would not replay. The times I had to confront relatives who sought favors. The awkwardness of setting legal protections to prevent predatory requests. But those were edges I navigated because I had decided dignity mattered more than the cobbling together a family image. The grandchildren grew into a kind of tether for everyone. They had in some ways been the quiet reason for many of my older decisions, to be a steady hand, to leave something that might make their lives easier. Watching them at birthday parties, muddy shoes tracked across new rugs, laughter breaking the air, reminded me that children are both innocent and forgiving. If they had been hurt, they healed faster than we did. Their presence made patience easier, because patience is a thing you do for the smallest among you when you believe the future is worth the work. There was one night some months after the wedding when I sat with Eli on the back steps and admitted a small fear. What if I have made all this about me? I asked.
What if in refusing Darius I have done something cruel? He listened, as he always did, and then squeezed my hand. You did not parcel out kindness to prove a point, he said. You set a boundary to teach what love that respects dignity looks like. That is a kind of mercy. His words were steadiness and did not remove the ache of the choice. Mercy, I had learned, was not always applause. Sometimes it looked like tough love administered with compassion and expectation. I saw that in Darius's attempts to repair. I saw that in the way our family navigated the small and large humiliations that had once been taken for granted. Years later, when people asked me if I regretted telling my son to leave that day, my answer was honest. Sometimes I missed the easy version of motherhood that forgave instantly and concealed pain. But more often, I felt that stern kind of pride you get when you have held a line that saved you from being less of yourself. The day I said out of my wedding had not been a tantrum, it had been a naming. Naming, I had discovered, is one of our last dignities when we are older. We name the behavior we will not accept. We insist that our worth is not negotiable. Darius and I did not have a fairy tale reconciliation. We had instead a complex truce that grew into something like respect. Conversations that once would have been about entitlement turned into discussions about grandchildren's schedules, about whether a family gathering might be an appropriate place for all of us. He learned how to apologize without being performative. He learned to ask for less and to accept a smaller margin of error. He repaired, slowly and sometimes awkwardly, the things he had broken. The foundation grew at a modest pace, funding work that helped women like me find housing, legal advice, companionship, and the dignity that simple, steady support can give. We refused interviews that would sensationalize the story and tried instead to use our platform to lift quiet voices. That was, to me, the most meaningful part of the whole messy thing, turning our personal pain into something that might help someone else avoid a similar erosion of dignity. On an ordinary afternoon, a neighbor knocked and handed me a stack of thank you notes. A woman who had received a grant to fix her roof wrote about sleeping with fear of water on her face again. An elderly man wrote that the weekly gardening club had given him purpose. Those small paper things, each with its imperfect handwriting, felt more important than any public accolade. They were proof that dignity, when defended, can extend outward like a chain of small kindnesses. In the end, what I learned most clearly was that love and boundaries are not enemies. They are different muscles. One demands softness, the other demands firmness. I had long been excellent at the former and poor at the latter.
Saying no at my wedding was not a drama I staged to hurt someone I loved. It was a long-delayed act of self-defense. It was also an invitation for Darius to step into accountability, for the family to examine how we used shame as a tool, and for me to choose a life where my worth was not conditional on others' whims. When people ask me how I survived the humiliation or how I lived through the sting of a son's contempt, I tell them this: survival began when I chose myself. It continued when I allowed others to show up with real effort, not merely with words. It matured when that effort led to repair, and it was tempered always, always by the knowledge that money is not the hero of this story. It is the light that showed us who we were. The photograph the photographer took that day, the one with me caught between hurt and fury, hung on my wall for a long time. I would look at it on bad days and remind myself of the moment I chose to insist on dignity. Later, when we framed a new picture of the two of us under the arbor, years into our marriage, the lines on my face had settled into a different kind of map. There was, in that picture, a softness that had not been there before, and a steadiness that had been paid for by hard choices. My son came back to the family in pieces, and then in larger parts. He asked more than once for forgiveness, and gave more than once the labor of restitution. It was neither quick nor flawless. It was, however, real. Darius's story is not mine to tidy. It is his to live. I measure success not in a headline of remorse, but in the quiet acts: paying a neighbor back, taking his children to school, sitting in therapy, those small, persistent stitches that stitch a life back together. If the title of this story feels flinty, my son and his wife mocked my new husband at my wedding, then the softer sentence that follows might be its real lesson. Then the old man shut everyone up, and the rest of our lives were changed. Not because of money alone, but because that moment demanded we reckon with ourselves. We were forced to decide whether we would continue living in patterns that hurt us, or whether we would choose dignity and risk a cost for it. If you took anything from this story, I hope it is this: setting boundaries does not make you cruel. It makes you honest. Loving someone does not obligate you to be their safety net in ways that enable harm. And when you have the chance to turn pain into purpose, do it with the steadiness you would want for yourself. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to insist on dignity. And if you have a moment, leave a comment about a time you had to choose yourself. Your words might mean more to someone else than you know.